Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't. We all know the expression that we are what we eat, yet few have devoted their lives to the science behind this idea more than the guest of this episode. Dr. Michael Jacobson earned a Ph.D. in microbiology from MIT and shortly after devoted his expertise to the budding field of nutrition science. Michael is the founder of the Center for Science in the Public Interest, and he has spent nearly 5 decades at the forefront of disseminating the best research available on food and health. He has also worked steadily on public policy relating to food, and he's been recognized for his contributions by the CDC and a host of other governmental and non-governmental organizations. His work includes a 25-year effort to create a national policy to ban partially hydrogenated oils. That law went into effect in 2018. Michael is now working on creating a national food museum, and we talk about that, his career in science, and psychologically what it's been like to be on the front lines engaged in his work. So listen in as Michael shares about his life in research and policy relating to food. Dr. Michael Jacobson, who has asked me to call him Michael, welcome to Super Psyched.
Thank you very much for having me, Adam. Great to be on with you.
Oh, it's so amazing. I've seen your face for well over 2 decades. I've subscribed to the Nutrition Action newsletter, for which I'm so grateful. My wife reads it cover to cover every month. I historically have done the same. And it's an incredible contribution you've made. Not only have you been the first person to come up with words like junk food and food porn, or calling pasta Alfredo a heart attack on a plate, and helped with the banning of partially hydrogenated oils. The number of things that you have done to help our country, I just can't express enough gratitude.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Working at the Center for Science in the Public Interest was certainly fun and gratifying, and we had some real successes on trans fat and getting a definition of organic, improving food safety and school food laws, and through Nutrition Action, educating zillions of people over the years.
Yeah. I believe I read a quote from Oprah saying that this was the gold standard for trustworthy science. If you needed to know really what's going on, look no further than the Nutrition Action newsletter. And you didn't just participate in this, you founded this thing after getting a Ph.D. in microbiology from, MIT. And that's how you decided to use your doctorate. What was it that drove you toward this mission in 1971 when people weren't even thinking really about this topic?
A series of accidents. So I got my Ph.D. in 1969, and those were the big anti-war years. Lots of civil rights demonstrations and progress being made. And so MIT was a hotbed, especially of anti-war activities, some environmental activities. And after I got my degree, I thought, well, maybe I'll take a year off and try to use my scientific knowledge to more directly influence public policies. I love doing research. So I said, okay, I'll take a year off. And I went down to Nader's office in Washington. And he said, look, this other guy has just finished writing a book about the Food and Drug Administration. Why don't you write a book on food additives? And so I said, okay, what's a food additive and how do you write a book? And Ralph said, you'll learn. And so I learned something about food additives, and writing a book came out in 1972. And one of my conclusions was that some food additives were unsafe. Many were not well enough tested. But the real problem in our food supply was not the additives, but the foods themselves. all the foods high in sugar, high in saturated fat, meat and cheese and egg yolks. So then I still follow food additives, but I really switched to nutrition. My food additive book came out in 1972. That's just CSPI, Center for Science in the Public Interest, was just starting. And I really had CSPI focus on nutrition, which it has been doing ever since. In 1974, I started the Nutrition Action Health Letter. I guess it was about a year as a free newsletter for nutritionists. But there was so much interest from the general public that we couldn't afford to give it out for free. So we started a subscription-based newsletter, which was the lifeblood of CSPI for 30 years, maybe. And now Nutrition Action circulation has been diminished because of the internet. So Nutrition Action was our main public education vehicle. And then we've done so much, and I shouldn't say we because I'm not part of CSPI anymore. I left the staff several years ago. But we really focused most of our attention on public policies, trying to influence the Food and Drug Administration, trying to get Congress to do one thing or another. So we were involved in those typical Washington battles between the progressive organizations fighting for change and typically the food industry opposing change.
Well, I would think that if you were to write an autobiography, it could be actually entitled Killing the Messenger, because all you're doing is saying, this is what is true according to science and according to double-blind studies, and the best instruments that we have are telling us this. And nobody wants to hear these relatively inconvenient truths. And so it's so funny to imagine you in the early 70s bumping into Ralph Nader, and you didn't even know at the time what a food additive was. I'm imagining you as you give your parents so much joy. I got a doctorate, and then what's he studying? And you're telling this to various people at cocktail parties. I'm studying food additives, and I'm guessing that you got a lot of sideways glances and a lot of skepticism. Right. And like, what are you even talking about? Are you from Mars?
Yeah, things were different 50 years ago. And the whole field of food and nutrition, grocery stores are different from they were 50 years ago, when whole wheat bread and yogurt were almost unknown in grocery stores. And now lots of whole grain products and lower sodium, fat-free, this or that, organic foods. So it's much easier to get a healthy diet now than it was 50 years ago. And in restaurants, most restaurant food is lousy, but there are some typically small chains that are based on salads or healthy ingredients. So you can eat out and not get socked with a pound of salt and saturated fat.
I'm going to go back to the idea of the pronoun and the use of the word we. You have been affiliated with CSPI well over 40 years, and you needed to correct yourself because you're no longer directly affiliated. But I'm imagining that deep down, this is deeply embedded in who you are. This is an organ that is going to be with you forever. So I think it's fair to say we. So I just wanted to note that. One of the things that the listener can probably hear is your warmth and your kindness. And you've just got just a lovely countenance. And meanwhile, I'm imagining you actually, because you had so much chutzpah to say the various things that you needed to say, you had a lot of haters. So what was it like? What's it been like for a nice guy with a doctor who's just trying to help people? What's it been like to deal with haters?
Well, the haters were mostly from the companies and trade associations that we criticized. And their animosity was a badge of honor in a way. You know, initially, I was pretty abrasive with these companies, but I learned that was stupid. And these are human beings who are company lobbyists, and that they know an awful lot, and they could be informative, and I can actually learn something from them. And then they might criticize me or CSPI publicly, but we would have perfectly congenial conversations behind the scenes, you know, out of the public domain. Some of those people I grew to really respect, that they have their own constraints. And we would attack companies at General Mills or General Foods. Those companies are never in a position to say, okay, we'll stop marketing sugar-sweetened beverages,
Right.
or we'll stop marketing hamburger sandwiches, because that's their lifeblood. They can't. So then it's a matter of, well, can you use less salt or have healthier alternatives to salads, Impossible burgers, and the like? Well, the industry would portray me as this evil incarnate. They knew better. Many of the people, some are just jerks, but other people I really grew to respect. And we can have real discussions about what the companies might be able to do.
That's such an important point. I'm thinking about a former guest of mine, Daryl Davis, an African-American musician who managed to befriend well over 200 people from the KKK and get them to tap into their truth. And they actually handed over their robes and left their affiliation with the KKK and
Really?
actually became promoters of diversity and kindness in many cases. But I'm thinking about you behind the scenes, deciding not to be a jerk in the face of them and asking yourself, well, what can I learn? And I think that's such a great and healthful perspective. I want to ask you about what you've learned, since this is a psychology podcast. What have you learned about food and mental health? How might certain foods contribute to our mental health, whereas others, as Dr. Ellen Vora, recently interviewed psychiatrist, notes that various foods with inflammation can actually contribute to anxiety, depression, sleep disorders, and of course, there are other feeding and other types of eating and feeding disorders that relate to everything that you've tried to counter. So I'm just wondering, what about food and mental health?
Well, I'm going to have to take the Fifth Amendment on that, Adam. But I will point out that food and meals are so important for getting people to socialize. We meet people over food. We have family dinners. Food is the centerpiece. But what else is going on is building friendships, communicating with one another. That sociability is so important. You know, aside from what you mentioned about one food contributing to some psychological problem or physical problem, I think a main thing is just in every culture, meals are a place where people get together. Of course, some families, you get together and you fight.
And they might not be as helpful.
Yeah. But in general, that's the time the family gets together.
So funny. I had this SNL skit in my mind. You've probably seen the Olive Garden ads where they say, when you're here, your family. And I was imagining like people going to the Olive Garden and they become family and they start fighting. And like that would be a great SNL skit in my mind. But you're talking about even the word companion is derived from the word com, which is together, pan, which is bread. So breaking bread together creates companionship. And that's really how our mammalian brains are so wired through the millennia, is to eat together. And that's so important for us to feel our humanness and our sense of connection and affiliation. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Oh, yeah. Yes. I think it's something to recognize and build on, especially for people who feel isolated, to look around and think, oh, is there somebody that I can invite to dinner, or can we go out for a meal? And even if most restaurant meals undermine people's health, but they can be very helpful for mental health.
There are two sides to this coin. So how do we solve for increasing the likelihood of the healthful benefits of eating together and perhaps reducing the more nefarious aspects of food? How do we maximize the good?
One is public education. The other thing is to beat up on the restaurant companies for serving junk and trying to persuade them to offer healthier options.
Someone might view this as a quixotic attempt on your part, and yet you have hard evidence that by speaking up and speaking out and being the lone person in the room, you've been criticized and even called a nanny by certain people, but by breaking through that you actually do have hard evidence that things change. What are some of the changes that you're happiest with during your tenure with CSPI and as a food advocate?
Well, biggest progress in terms of dietary health was banning partially hydrogenated vegetable oil, trans fat. And that probably is saving 50,000 or more lives per year. So just enormous. And it was such an interesting battle. We started in 1992, 1991, and it took 25 years to actually accomplish it. And, after a few years, so in the mid 90s, there was sufficient evidence that trans fat was even worse than saturated fat in promoting heart disease. But it was just this long, hard battle of trying to get the government to do the right thing. And the Food and Drug Administration, FDA stands for foot dragging artists. They're typically cowards when it comes to taking some strong actions. Denmark banned trans fat a dozen years before the United States did. And it's harder in the US than a small country. But Denmark proved that a country could ban this ingredient without a catastrophe happening. In fact, nothing happened. But, 25 years to have this happen, it's just an indictment of our system and all the influence that industry can place on the government, that lobbyists can place on Congress, and then Congress says, okay, FDA, if you do this or that, we're cutting your funding. Or putting something into an appropriations bill that will prevent you from doing what you're planning to do. So this battle over trans fat is a great thing for political scientists as well as the public to understand and see what are the forces at play. You have the science, and once the science is established, then the battle really begins on everything. So when I came to Washington, I thought, well, if you had an article in the New York Times, surely that would push the government to do the right thing.
Right.
So I was working on a particular food additive.
Sure.
And the New York Times had an article about it. I didn't know about it, a front page article about brominated vegetable oil. I didn't even know about it for 3 months. The article had no impact whatsoever. And that these battles, they go on forever. Salt is something else. I've done a lot of work on the harm caused by diets with excessive sodium, killing as many as 100,000 people a year to this day. And the battle really went back to a 1969 White House conference on food and nutrition, where one of the recommendations was to get industry to reduce salt. Salt has not been reduced in 50 years. We're consuming just about the same amount of salt. And the government is not capable of taking a strong measure to lower sodium levels, even though most companies could reduce sodium through one mechanism or another by half or more, depending on the food.
And, I'm thinking about the chasm that exists in the human mind between what we know and what we do. And we all know what we should do, and yet there's an emotional thing that can override that intellectual awareness. And one of the things that two brilliant economists from the University of your hometown, Chicago, Thaler and Sunstein, I believe are their names, wrote a book called Nudge. And they were talking about the easiest ways to implement behavior change on the big level, and that is to make decisions easier for people to do the right thing. And that seems like that's what you've done. And I want to also just comment on something else and ask you about this, because you're talking about the foot dragging administration as you see it. That's part of the story. But as a former sales rep, before I became a psychologist, I was in sales. And sometimes the sales cycle for what I was selling was so long and complex. It was a slog. It took up to 2 years. And it caused huge attrition amongst my colleagues just because it was not a slam dunk easy sale. The part of this story for me that I take interest in is what kept you in this slog, this marathon for 25 years with so many close calls of probably closing the deal, and then it didn't quite close. And then you had to have that tenacity and belief in what you're doing. To me, this story really, it's partially like how long it took, but the other part is the energy that you expended to get this done. How did you do it?
Well,
How did you find the energy, I should say?
one thing is that these battles are actually fun, trying to think of new strategies. Can you come at it from another angle?
That's awesome.
And so over the course of those years, we would file petitions with the Food and Drug Administration. I published several scientific studies on the trans fat content of different foods. And then trans fat was not the only thing I worked on in those 25 years. So I could put it aside for 6 months, do something else. And we have some other battles, other irons in the fire. And then you do make incremental progress. Some company says, okay, we're going to stop using trans fat in the next couple of years. And I met with Walmart, and they agreed to stop using trans fat in their house brand product. And they would put pressure on major brands to stop using it. So there are incremental victories until we got the whole ball of wax.
So I think you've actually keyed into the answer to virtually 80% of life's problems. And that is, you made it fun and you imbued the really, huge amounts of gravity around this idea, but you decided to try to find a way to make it fun and to see each minor victory along the way, each little battle that you won towards the major operation. I don't want to call it a war because it seems too contentious, but each win along the way. How do you find the fun in the midst of that?
Well, some of it is, imagine little Mike Jacobson from Chicago is battling with Kraft or Walmart or some other company. And this David and Goliath thing is some of it. Getting an article published, a scientific paper, getting a great story on a TV magazine show. It keeps the spirits alive.
So before we close, I want to ask you a bit about your latest project, which is phenomenal. I'm really excited about it, and I know you are too. And that would be the National Food Museum. That is a work in progress. And as you've been finding the energy to do this, little miracles along the way have shown up. But let's hear about the purpose of the Food Museum and your vision for it.
Well, I've always loved museums, and I loved at Center for Science producing little displays that I would carry on talk shows. For instance, when I was publicizing books, a graduated cylinder showing how much fat is in a Wendy's triple cheeseburger. It has such an impression on people. And after I left CSPI, and actually just about a year ago, I realized that there is no food museum. There are a lot of museums on different things. There are temporary exhibits about food at different museums. But I envision producing a museum, creating a museum that would have exhibits on a wide range of food issues. And food touches so many things. So an obvious thing is the history of the human diet going back 15,000 years. Or what's the human diet now? Hunter-gatherers in isolated places in South America, Africa, Asia eat a very different diet from Eskimos or somebody in San Francisco. But the controversial areas are the impact of food and farming on health and the environment. So with health, food is essential for health. Food has cured scurvy and beriberi and all these deficiency diseases, but in its place, we have diabetes, heart disease, stroke, cancers, obesity. And for agriculture, we have horrendous conditions on factory farms, these huge feedlots, the use of antibiotics to promote growth in animals, air and water pollution from feedlots, growing all the grain that livestock eat, and the growing of the grain requires huge amounts of fertilizer and pesticides, which require a lot of energy, contributing to climate change. So it's how we eat and how we farm have a real impact on our health, our country, and the world. And a museum could explain that, and it can also explain what are some of the solutions to those very serious problems. And it's got to be fun. The museum will be fun. And so I envision having a room in which at least one wall is covered with a giant video screen. And the video screen would be showing old TV commercials, skits from Saturday Night Live,
so good.
I Love Lucy, or Charlie Chaplin. There's some just great videos that you find on YouTube. And you can really study the history of Americans' relationship to food, our understanding, by looking at old commercials. That would be so much fun to have that.
That is wonderful. Oh my gosh. Well, I must ask one final question to you before you go. And that is, if you had one tip through your years, what has been your favorite tip around nutrition that people can easily implement into their lives?
I think it's eating more whole grains, fruits, vegetables, beans. That's it.
Yeah, right on. Well, Michael, I am so grateful for you, for your contributions to the betterment of our health and your continued work, and that you would share some time with me. I'm just so grateful to you, Michael. I've held you in high regard for 2 decades, I should say. And just thank you is all I can say.
Thank you very much, Adam. And I'm so pleased that you decided to interview me. It's an honor to be on your show.
Oh, thanks so much. This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.